Today, Olaf and I will be talking about how to get started with AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud with Terraform. Olaf will be doing more of a pair programming approach today. Olaf will be presenting his screen, and then I'll be talking him through how to authenticate. A lot of this stuff is very basic, so each step shouldn't take very long. We're going to try to be consistent on how each step, each cloud provider is authenticated to. There are multiple ways to authenticate to the cloud. There's service accounts, there's managed principals in Azure. So we're just going to kind of go through just getting started on your local machine, creating a simple resource.
Which one are we going to start with, Jason?
Let's start with, I think we should start with the AWS. If you go to the Terraform registry, a lot of this stuff is actually outlined step by step. You can take, if you're looking at the AWS provider like I am right now, you can basically copy the block that's from Terraform all the way down to the AWS VPC and paste it, and you can have the syntax, everything, and then everything already created.
So, do you want me to paste in the block code that they offer as an example on the registry?
Yes.
Okay, we'll do that. We can speed things up a little bit. So, I'm going to be using the Terraform block and the required providers block underneath that. And so, for this one, you said it's going to be AWS. And I will, I said I would paste it, but then I just started typing. So, sorry.
This works.
This gives me a chance to provide typos and see if it's right.
Right. Like I said, you're defining the source right here. Now you are pinning, when you type this in, you're actually pinning the version to that version. As we've discussed in other videos,
That's right.
you want to pick specific providers initially, and then you'll, like, as things change, they update every like week or so. You're going to want to update each path, but
And I
pinning
think
your
this is the
version.
latest one, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. You'll want to um, update, each version whenever you can, if you like, if you like to keep your code up to date. One thing I noticed between the registry and the actual like learn HashiCorp documentation is they had different versions in their documentation, because like documentation changes, um, the providers change faster than the documentation. So if you
That's a
go,
great point. Yeah. So should I use the one that's provided in the example and learn, or should I just use the latest that shows up in the documentation for the provider itself?
I would use the provider documentation more than the learn Terraform.
Okay.
It's like kind of using it as a balance, like a check back and forth. But if you start with the most recent provider, then the documentation for the other resources that you're going to be like actually using in your Terraform will be accurate. If you're using an older version of the provider, then you can't always guarantee that all the attributes equal. We've talked about this in the previous video.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's good advice. And I have actually been in that position where you get stuck and you are on an older provider, and it becomes the more code you write with an older provider, the more difficult it becomes to move into a more recent version.
Okay,
All right,
so
and the
next,
provider documentation also tells me that I need to use a provider block. Should I go ahead and write that?
yes,
Okay.
and here you need to define what region you are in. So you just do
Okay.
region equals, and each cloud provider has a slightly different, like how they define what a region is and the syntax of it. So you're using US East 2.
This is just one I remember. I don't know if it's the best by any means.
No, yeah. Well, my understanding on AWS is US East 1 is where all their resources go first, and then it gets distributed throughout the cloud. I think I've heard that.
Okay. Should I target East 1 then?
Sure. Now, we're going to create a resource for AWS for VPC. So let's go ahead and just add resource.
And do we have, I should ask, do we have valid code at this point? So I've got basically just a Terraform block and a provider block. I'm not creating anything, obviously, but Is this a phase at which Terraform would agree and say, yes, you have a valid block. I can initialize this and download the provider at this point.
Well, yeah, we can test that out. Let's do a
Okay.
Terraform validate and also a Terraform init and see if it even works at this point.
All right.
And as you see, it's pulling down that version of
Yep.
AWS Provider.
We've got 4.10 previously installed, and it does successfully initialize. And then you said to do a validate as well. So let's try that. And success.
So,
There's not much to
yay.
validate in this case, but it's a start.
You never know if you're missing Embrace, you know?
Indeed.
Okay.
And you said
so
we wanted to create a resource now.
Yeah, let's create a resource. The one we're in the documentation we're going to be copying from is an AWS VPC. So you just need an underscore between them. And then in this case, you need to define a CIDR block.
And remind me, because I'm, an Azure person. I don't know anything about AWS, right? What is a VPC?
A VPC is, I would say, equivalent to like a VNet. So it's a virtual network within AWS.
Cloud networks. This is presumably just like anything else. This is an IPv4 network living in cloud, software-defined network for that matter, and one that probably isn't absolutely necessary for everything. But if you want to reach these resources using an on-prem network or a VPN or something, that is probably absolutely necessary.
I would agree in Azure. That's true.
Okay.
I think it's a little bit more required in AWS.
Oh, okay.
Is my overall impression. I am not super in depth into AWS, but AWS, each cloud provider has a different flavor on how they do resources, and I see a lot more VPCs and stuff implemented there.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so I gave it a Class C network on 10, very common. Let's just grab that 10 and grab the last octet of it.
Right.
I assume that's okay, right? It's okay if I've got duplicate VPCs. This is within my own account, so it doesn't matter what block I give it, as long as that block's not, well, even if it's already in use, I presume that it's not going to really care until I try to route those networks. At that point, things get interesting.
Yeah, this is a giant conversation on its own. So yes, as long as they are within your cloud environment, they are different. You're good to go. One thing we should be aware of is you want to use a private IP range. You don't want to use a public IP range because you'll start having problems. Most of us would just start with 10 dot because it's mostly easier. But yeah, definitely, like, that's the biggest key is, for your local, if you have multiple subnets, you don't really want to collide them, especially if you're using like private. You want private for sure. Public would be bad for you. And this could be a whole different video about networking, but we'll keep going.
Okay.
So now you should be able to run a AWS configure. And all this stuff is
like shortening it.
Okay. So now we're authenticating via the command line. When you create your user, we can go through the CLI or the portal, but when you create your user, you need to create a secret key with that. And once you do that, it'll basically pull down you can pull down the file, and you can pull out the resources like the access key ID and the secret access key. It's a relatively simple thing to do. You just don't want to lose it. If you lose it, you have to recreate it. But the provider is using your secret key to authenticate to the cloud for AWS. If you go ahead and run a Terraform plan.
All right. It's exciting. We're actually creating a resource out there.
And
Looks like there is one.
It's funny that just because we define one attribute, all these other things are auto known after apply.
Yeah, lots of defaults, and I've thought about this actually myself too. There are so many defaults, and I guess what we have to remember is that um, there are a lot of defaults that you may or may not realize are getting applied, and so then referring to the documentation, if you need to override any of these, then you have to specify them and then modify what that default is.
Great. So now if you wanted to do an apply, you can.
Okay, let's do it. But it's pretty quick.
And then go ahead and hit yes. And we're done.
Excellent. Yeah. Seems like
Now
it
you
works.
should be able to go into your portal, good for AWS, and you'll see a VPC created there. Now we're going to go ahead and go on to the next provider, which would be the AzureRM Provider. So
Okay.
just go ahead and do a Terraform destroy here.
Ah, tearing down the VPC.
Okay. So go ahead and erase all that.
Okay.
Well, I guess we could just change it. So yeah, we're going to use the same kind of required providers. Just go ahead and change that to Azure RM equals, yeah, curly Q's, and then source is the same, equals HashiCorp Azure RM version 3.0.0 or whatever the current is. What is
Yeah,
it?
we're up to 3.2 now. I know we just released our video not long ago on 3.0, and rapidly we're up to 3.2.
Oh, sweet. Um, Now for the provider, now at the on line 10, change that to Azure. And in Azure, you need to define the features block.
So,
Now,
like we did before, maybe I can initialize this and make sure that everything is copacetic.
yep, and do a
We
Terraform validate.
added it. Yeah.
Now, technically, the initialize will help kind of do a validate, because if you had anything significantly broken in your syntax, it won't even initialize.
Okay.
But this helps there too. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a resource group here.
Okay. This is in Azure RM, so we lead with the provider name, and you said a resource group. All right. And what do I need to specify for the resource group?
You need the name, so name
Okay.
equals, and this
I'm
can
just
be
gonna.
anything you want.
Okay.
And then the location you
Azure.
want is, yeah,
The location, if we're using what we just learned about AWS, this is similar to a region, right?
yeah.
So I will use East US 2, top of mind.
Okay,
Anything else I should add for that, or is that okay?
that's fine.
Okay.
What we need to do is go to the bottom, and we need to do an AZ login. Now a browser should have popped up on your screen somewhere,
It did.
and it'll allow you to pick your user you want to authenticate into Azure.
And I am logged in, and we can see here that I have login validation.
Great. Now you should be able to do a Terraform plan.
All right, and this similarly to the AWS provider says that we have one resource to add. This one is a little bit, I guess, smaller or less complex, being is that there are only 3 arguments
Mhm.
that are showing up at the end.
Right.
Okay, and can we apply this?
Yes, go ahead. As discussed before, a resource group is required for all the different resources to be stored into. This is like the basic unit.
Yeah, I feel like a resource group is basically like a folder
Mhm.
in a file system. So it's just sort of a logical organization construct. And I don't know if those
That
are
actually
in
might be
all of the
true with
providers.
Microsoft.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't think it
it probably
is.
is a folder.
Okay, so you have your resource group created. That means we're able to authenticate. The Terraform code is functional, and now we can do a Terraform destroy.
Okay. I do get the impression that this is pretty easy to get up and started with a provider. Now we'll see if Google Cloud is the same or if it's any different in terms to this workflow.
Yeah, they're all pretty easy to get started, but I feel like if you haven't done it before, just trying to read the documentation and knowing what is good to take, what is not, can be kind of tricky and how to get things loaded. You know, we need, you need each SDK to be loaded and installed. You may not necessarily know that.
Mhm.
You need Terraform installed on your computer. We recently had a conversation with somebody in the Discord, and they wanted to learn Terraform. And step one was, have you installed Terraform yet? And I think the answer was no. So we went ahead and did that.
It's a good first step, I suppose.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so I take it we will probably
Just go
scrub
ahead.
this
Yeah, scrub that.
and change this to the next one, which, if I'm not mistaken, will now
It's just
be
Google.
okay.
And we'll change the source to HashiCorp Google. And they are
And what
currently
version?
on 4.17.0.
Okay, excellent. And I'll need a new provider block.
Yes. It also is Google.
So why, Jason, do I have why do I have to create 2 provider blocks? I have one underneath this Terraform block, and then I have to write a provider block over here.
I think one just defines the versions of the provider that you're trying to install. And then you can, like, that's where you would pin in things like that. And the second one is actually using it and defining like what region you're in. But I think you don't necessarily need the required block all the time.
Okay.
I think I've seen that recently.
Yeah, I suppose it's fair. The defaults might be just to use the latest version and probably to search the HashiCorp registry for that named provider to see if it exists out there.
This one's a little trickier. Like in all these different providers, you need an account for
Mhm.
each one. Like you need an AWS account, you need an Azure subscription, you need a Google Cloud account, or I think it's called a project here. So within this provider, you should define the project you're working in.
Okay.
And I think you have that local somewhere. Thanks. And then region is US Central 1
Okay.
with a dash in it. Yep.
Is it just central one with no dash or with a dash?
US dash Central 1. And then here we define the zone. So it's zone quote US dash Central 1 dash C.
Okay.
Okay.
How many zones
So
are in Central One? Do you know?
I don't know, but I think it's interesting that you would define it. Like in
Right.
Azure, you define it
For a
on a
resource.
resource space. And AWS, I think what was it? US Central, US East 1. So you kind of define it there, but this is like you define the AZ location or the see those the zones. Yeah, so you define like the overall zone, right? You're like, I'm in US East 1, and inside that, you don't care specifically about which zone you're in. This one's like defining you're in the C zone.
Right.
So
For
I
this
think that's
provider.
interesting. Yeah. Um, Now we will be creating, I think it's a network. Let me
Okay.
highlight it here. It's so it's a resource.
Google something.
Yeah, it's Google Compute _ network. And then this called you can name it
Whatever
whatever
I
you
call
want.
it. Yep.
And then it's name and then whatever you want.
Okay. So,
So
is this the only required field?
it is
Okay.
in this case. Before we go too much further, we also want to do a Terraform init.
Yes, there's the 4.17.
And then a Terraform
And
validate.
yeah, I'll validate that. Syntax is good. I'm even going to clean it up. Yeah, just line up those
Make it
equals since
pretty.
I have more than one. Yeah, for our viewers' sake.
Right. Also, we want to do there's a Google command. It's Google gcloud auth
Auth application default.
application default. Yeah.
Yeah. Login. Yeah, so this is similar then to a Z login or AWS configure. This is just setting up the gcloud API, I presume, to use whatever credentials I have for Google to now be extended to Terraform as well. And this, you said earlier, we have to make sure that we are installing our CLIs or SDKs. So gcloud is the version here that I've gcloud SDK is the software that I've installed here to do this.
That is correct.
Yeah.
So go ahead and hit. I think you.
Yeah, I'm. That logs me into Google Cloud Console, just like the other ones have done as well.
Okay, great. Now we should be able to do a Terraform plan.
All right, we've got one to add.
And now we're back to it. So since it's a networking component, we have more attributes that could be set or overridden if you needed to. And know that each one's totally different, right? So if you have like each provider has a different way of handling the same kind of thing. So if you're trying to be cross provider, you just kind of learn what the flavors are for each thing.
Right. So it's I guess what's interesting for me to note here is that while the syntax isn't exactly the same, like the resource objects themselves are a little bit different per providers, but the workflow is identical. So whether I'm working in AWS, Azure, or GCP, I'm following the same sort of workflow or procedures that you've outlined here to get the same results. And in the end, Terraform Apply is taking care of all of this for me. Right.
I think the biggest trick is trying to figure out what it translates to. So if you're in one cloud, you're used to it. What is that in the other one, and how does it work? Right. Okay, so we've created a new network.
Created a compute network.
We can go ahead and destroy it, and then we should be good to go. Terraform is very good at being available for multiple cloud providers that we've discussed before. Like the biggest selling point, when you're talking to some people, they're like, why wouldn't I just use Azure Bicep or just the cloud formation? And yes, those are all valid things, but I feel that it's more of like as an engineer perspective, I can't be solely reliant on their cloud tools because I never know if I'm going to be called upon to learn AWS in a week. Like how do I get this to work?
I can definitely see what you're saying. If you're working in consulting or some sort of service organization, then indeed you may be servicing or supporting any of these clouds. I would say it's also true though, if you're an enterprise, more and more I'm seeing that enterprises are moving to hybrid cloud or multi-cloud. So whether you're using Terraform to handle on-prem compute or multiple cloud compute, I think that all of those are things that Terraform does well, just as each of the individual tools service their own resources well. But by sort of putting some investment into a tool like Terraform, then you are able to gather the knowledge to manage your configuration as code in all of these different locations.
Right. And like a separate engineer could come in and look at your Terraform and mostly translate it, and it's not so cloud specific. You're not trying to figure out what cloud formation is or trying to figure out, you know, bicep on
Mm,
top of learning how to make the actual resource work.
right.
So we have gone through, in summary, we have gone through Google Cloud, AWS, Azure RM on how to authenticate and create your first resource. I think this is a good step for anybody who's been in kind of an intro. Me learning for researching this video, figuring out Google Cloud. I've been doing Terraform for years now, and you're like, oh, this is a new provider. Well, how do I do it? Oh, it's basically the same steps, just a different, toolkit. So that was nice.
Yeah, I think that's great. And as I pointed out a minute ago, it's still true with Google. Um, the steps are more or less the same. It is really easy for me to get up and started working with any of these providers. And given that I understand the intricacies of using one of these cloud providers, I can then start making steps beyond just simple compute network or resource groups or VPCs and build out my enterprise solution just resource block by resource block.
Mhm. Yep, I agree. Well, thank you,
All right.
everybody.
Well, thank you for showing me through that. I think I picked up a few skills here along the way as well. So I appreciate that, Jason.
Yeah, nice typing on screen.
Hey, thanks. The pressure was on. I felt it.